The forest swallowed the road hole, or so it felt. My old truck, a tired beast of steel and rust, groaned beneath the weight of my meager belongings and a grief that still clung to me like damp earth. Sunlight, fractured and pale, struggled to pierce the dense canopy of ancient pines and gnarled oaks, leaving the path ahead in a perpetual twilight. The air, heavy and cool, smelled of wet leaves, pine needles, and something else. A faint, metallic tang, like old coins left out in the rain, or perhaps simply the rust of my own vehicle. I pressed on, my jaw tight, a determined ache behind my eyes. This was it then. The inheritance. The retreat. The fresh start I had so desperately convinced myself I needed. The cabin appeared suddenly, a hunched, grey silhouette against the verdant wall of trees. It looked less like a home and more like a forgotten sentinel, weathering centuries of silence. Its clapboard siding was peeling like sunburnt skin, the roof shingles curled and brittle, and the windows, dark and vacant, stared out like blind eyes. A porch, sagging and treacherous, greeted me with a chorus of creaks as I stepped onto it, the wood groaning beneath my weight. The air here on the threshold felt different, thicker, as if holding its breath. I pushed open the heavy front door. It yielded with a drawn-out shriek, a sound that seemed to echo not just through the cabin, but through the very bones of the forest. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that dared to penetrate the gloom, swirling like tiny, frantic spirits. My hand, calloused from years of drafting and sketching, ran along a wooden banister, thick with grime. My fingers traced phantom patterns in the dust, a habit I'd picked up since everything changed. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to dispel the tightness in my chest. This was what I'd sought. Isolation, place untainted by the ghosts of my recent past, a canvas for reconstruction. I moved through the downstairs, each step raising a cloud of fine grey powder. The furniture, draped in moth-eaten sheets, resembled shrouded corpses. I imagined my ancestors here, their faces obscured by the passage of time, their hands touching these very surfaces. What did they seek in this solitude? What did they find? My gaze drifted to a small, built-in bookshelf, overflowing with ancient, leather-bound tomes whose titles were too faded to read. My fingers brushed against one, and a sudden, disorienting flicker stole across my vision. For a terrifying, boundless second, I wasn't in the dusty, silent cabin. I was standing in a school hallway during summer with wrong decorations. The fluorescent lights hummed with a sickly yellow glow, but instead of children's drawings, the walls were adorned with dried, skeletal branches and crude, unsettling symbols painted in what looked like rust. A faint, sweet sickly smell, like the one in the cabin, permeated the air. The lacquers, usually vibrant, were dull, scratched metal, and the silence was deep, oppressive, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of something unseen. My breath hitched. Then just as quickly it vanished. I blinked, rubbing my eyes fiercely. Fatigue, I told myself, a trick of the light, a lingering fragment of a stress-induced dream. My mind was playing games, still reeling from the emptiness that had settled in my life. I shook my head, dismissing the unsettling image, forcing my focus back to the tangible decay around me. Upstairs, the floorboards groaned underfoot, each step a mournful sigh. There were 3 bedrooms, all similarly shrouded, all equally desolate. In the largest, which I instinctively knew must have belonged to generations of my family, a heavy wooden chest sat at the foot of the bed. The carvings weren't merely decorative. They were deliberate, repetitive spirals and interlocking angles that seemed to possess a strange, hypnotic quality. They felt ancient, far older than the cabin itself, and strangely out of place amidst the rustic simplicity. This was the reveal. Not a grand discovery, not a hidden passage or a forgotten treasure, but this chest. Its presence, its peculiar ornamentation, struck a chord of unease. It wasn't just old, it felt other. I ran my thumb over a particularly deep groove, a spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward, and a faint, almost imperceptible warmth radiated from the wood. My breath hitched again, but I quickly attributed it to the exertion of kneeling, the stuffiness of the room. It was just a chest, an heirloom, a piece of old furniture, nothing more. I stood, my gaze sweeping the room again. The air felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken histories. It was a blank slate, albeit one buried under layers of dust and time. I would clean it, restore it, breathe new life into its crumbling walls. I would find my footing again here, in the heart of this ancient, nameless forest. I would not be broken, not again. The cabin, when it finally emerged from the emerald gloom, was less a sanctuary and more a forgotten sentinel, its timber walls warped by time, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the encroaching wilderness. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay and forgotten things, damp wood, dust motes dancing in the slivers of light, and something else, something metallic and cold, like old blood or rusty iron. I spent the first hours simply moving through the rooms, a ghost in my own inheritance. Each floorboard creaked a lament beneath my boots. Each breath I took stirred decades of settled dust. There were no grand revelations, only the quiet, suffocating presence of abandonment. I found an old cart, stripped it of its ancient, stiff mattress, and laid my own sleeping bag upon the bare springs. Sleep, I hoped, would offer a brief reprieve from the silence that hummed with unspoken histories. But sleep was a fractured mirror, reflecting distorted realities. I found myself not in the cabin, but adrift in a place that defied all logic, a waking nightmare that clung to my eyelids like cobwebs. The linoleum floor, scarred and dull, stretched endlessly under flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed with a dying hum. Lacquers, painted a sickly institutional green, lined the walls, but instead of student art or schedules, they were adorned with brittle, yellowed wreaths of dried flowers and faded ribbons, like a macabre belated harvest festival. Paper cutout snowflakes, once pristine white, now grey and curling at the edges, hung from the ceiling, swaying gently in a phantom breeze. I tried to move, but my feet felt encased in lead. The cabin was utterly silent, save for the rhythmic rasp of the wind against the chimney. I sat up, clutching my knees, the image of those withered wreaths and decaying snowflakes seared into my mind. What was that place? Why did it feel so intimately wrong? A new sound then, distinct from the cabin's usual groans and sighs. A scraping. Soft, persistent, coming from the far end of the single-room structure. It was like fingernails dragging across rough stone, or something being slowly, deliberately pushed. But the sound had a rhythm, a cadence that felt too purposeful to be mere happenstance. Driven by a strange mix of fear and the stubborn determination that had brought me to this God-forsaken place, I rose. The scraping grew louder as I approached the heavy, oak-paneled wall that separated the main living space from what was likely a small storage pantry. It hadn't been there yesterday. I knelt, pressing my ear close. The scraping continued, now accompanied by a faint, guttural hum that vibrated through the old timber. With trembling fingers, I pushed against the wall. It gave way with a groan of rusted hinges, revealing not a pantry, but a narrow, dust-choked recess. The scraping sound had been the barks being slowly pushed from its hidden nook. Reveal/discovery. Beside the barks, nestled in a bed of dry, crumbling leaves, lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was stiff, worn smooth by countless hands, and entirely blank save for a single, stark etching, the same gaping Morse symbol carved into the barks. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with tight, spidery script, written in an ink so faded it was almost impossible to decipher. The first legible words I could make out, scrawled across the opening page, sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. The pact must be fed. The forest remembers. My mind reeled. This wasn't some quaint family heirloom. This was a secret, hidden away, now revealed by an unseen hand. The cabin was not just a repository of dust and memories. It was a living tomb, and something beneath its floor, beneath the ancient forest, was stirring, reaching out, and beginning to remember me. My hands trembled, the brittle parchment of the journal rustling like dried leaves in a phantom wind. The revelation of a secret, hidden pact, a living tomb beneath the very floorboards. It was too much, yet not enough. A desperate hunger for understanding gnawed at me, overriding the primal urge to flee. This cabin, once a symbol of solace, now felt like a cage, its timbers groaning under the weight of an unseen pressure. I wasn't just here to mourn, I was here to uncover. I forced myself to breathe, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang that had begun to permeate the cabin. My gaze swept across the study, the heavy oak furniture, the dusty shelves. Each object seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Driven by a grim determination, I reopened the journal. The script was difficult, cramped, often fading into illegibility, but I pushed through, my eyes scanning for any anchor, any solid piece of information amidst the swirling madness. The entries were sporadic, separated by years, sometimes decades. They spoke of the root, the sleeper, the ancient hunger. My ancestors, it seemed, had been both keepers and victims. Phrases like the bargain struck, the tithe paid, the soil made fertile by blood recurred with sickening frequency. A profound sense of dread coiled in my gut. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a generational curse, an inheritance far darker than any material wealth. Then, a page, bound tighter than the rest, unfolded with a crackle. The handwriting was firmer here, belonging to a different hand, perhaps a great uncle or even my great-grandfather. It detailed not just observations, but instructions. The pact, it stated, must be renewed by the last of the line. The earth demands its due. The grief of the heir, the sorrow of the final seed, shall serve as the anchor. My breath hitched. The grief of the heir. My recent loss, the gaping wound in my soul, it wasn't just an unfortunate coincidence. It was a catalyst. I was the last, the final seed, drawn here not by chance, but by an ancient, predatory design. I wasn't seeking solace. I was being harvested. A low hum began, a vibration that started in my teeth and traveled down into my bones. The air grew heavy, thick with a cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left to decay in the sun, mingled with the pungent smell of damp, turned earth. The walls of the study, sturdy planks of oak, began to ripple. The wood seemed to soften, to stretch, its grain blurring into indistinct patterns. The cabin warped. The familiar lines of the room dissolved, melting away like wax. The ceiling stretched impassably high, the floor flattened into a uniform, pale surface. In an instant, the rough-hewn beams and stacked books were gone, replaced by a long, empty school hallway. I stood frozen, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, struggling to reconcile the impossible. It was summer, undoubtedly. Weak, jaundiced light filtered through high, grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stagnant air. But the decorations were wrong. Faded construction paper cutouts, meant to be whimsical, instead depicted monstrous, multi-eyed figures with spindly limbs, hanging askew from the ceiling tiles. Lacquers lined both sides of the hallway, their metallic surfaces dull and scarred, taped shut with brittle, yellowing warnings written in a script I recognized from the journal, a desperate, archaic scrawl. An invisible weight pressed down on me, a profound sense of being watched, examined, every fiber of my being laid bare. I wasn't just observing this impassable space. I was in it, a specimen under a malevolent gaze. A subtle, insistent tug began, not on my clothes, but on my consciousness, a gentle persuasion to move deeper into the impassable hallway. The monstrous paper figures seemed to sway slightly in my peripheral vision, their many eyes fixed on me. This wasn't just a dream. This was a manifestation, a tendril of the entity's influence reaching directly into my mind, warping reality around me. It knew I was here. It was testing me. With a ragged gasp, the hallway shimmered, its impassable geometry wavering like a heat haze. The sickly yellow light pulsed, then snapped. The linoleum floor buckled, the lacquers dissolved, and the paper monstrosities disintegrated into motes of dust. In a jarring instant, I was back in the study, clutching the journal, my knuckles white, my whole body trembling. The air was still heavy, the cloying scent of decaying blossoms and damp earth clinging to my clothes, to my very skin. My mind reeled, trying to process the impossible shift. It was alive, aware, and capable of reaching into my consciousness, twisting my perceptions, blurring the lines between what was real and what was not. It had shown me a glimpse of its reach, a distorted echo of a place of learning, corrupted by its ancient hunger. The journal's words screamed in my head, the grief of the heir shall serve as the anchor. I wasn't just an heir. I was a tether, a vessel. I was the next sacrifice, or the next keeper of an unspeakable horror. From directly beneath my feet, a low, guttural scrape echoed, louder and more insistent than any sound I had heard before. It wasn't the sound of wood on wood or stone on earth. It was something deeper, something organic, something vast, shifting beneath the thin veneer of the world. It was waking, and it knew I was here. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound less heard than felt, a deep thrumming that resonated in the hollows of my chest. It was not the wind, nor the groan of old timbers settling. This was something else entirely, an immense, patient breath drawn from the earth itself, stirring beneath the cabin's ancient foundations. My realization, sharp and cold, that I was not seeking solace but being sought, solidified into an icy certainty. I was not merely in danger, I was prey. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp soil, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like spilled copper left to oxidize. The light filtering through the grimy windows seemed to dim, as if the very atmosphere inside the cabin was absorbing the sun's meager offerings. Dust motes, previously dancing in lazy spirals, now spun with a frantic energy, caught in unseen currents. I stood rooted, my hands clenching at my sides, every nerve ending taut, listening to the cabin itself begin to protest, a chorus of faint creaks and groans that seemed to answer the subterranean hum. Then, a flicker. At the periphery of my vision, the rough-hewn wall beside the fireplace seemed to ripple, the aged wood grain blurring like a watercolor smudged by rain. I blinked, rubbing at my eyes, convinced fatigue was playing cruel tricks. But when I opened them again, the distortion remained, growing, pulling at the very fabric of the room. The familiar lines of the cabin, its comforting decay, began to stretch, to warp. The low ceiling lifted, the narrow walls widened, and the rough timber of the main room dissolved into something utterly alien. My breath caught in my throat, a gasp that tasted of rust and fear. On either side, rows of metallic lacquers, their paint chipped and scarred, stood sentinel. A sickly, fluorescent light, emanating from unseen fixtures above, cast everything in a pallid, buzzing glow. The air here was stale, thick with the forgotten scent of chalk dust and cheap disinfectant. But it was the decorations that truly twisted my gut, strung haphazardly along the lacquers, stapled to corkboards, and taped to the peeling walls were children's drawings. Not the vibrant, innocent scribbles I knew, but crude, disturbing images rendered in muted, earthy tones: ochre, sepia, a disturbing shade of bruised purple. These weren't school projects. They were ritualistic offerings, primal warnings. The sap smelled of rot and something else, something ancient and cloying, like the breath of a tomb. A primal scream clawed at my throat, but no sound escaped. My legs, heavy as stone, refused to move. I was trapped within this waking nightmare, a prisoner in a space that was both real and impassable. A single lacquer, directly in front of me, began to vibrate. The metal shivered, a low groan escaping its depths, a sound that was somehow both mechanical and organic. Then, slowly, with an agonizing shriek of tortured metal, its door began to peel open. I could feel its immense gravity, a suction that threatened to tear me from the floor. This was an immediate, undeniable presence. The cabin wasn't just old, it was alive, and it was reaching for me. The entity wasn't just awakening, it was here now, manifesting its terrible reality, not just in the ancient pacts of my ancestors, but in the very air I breathed, in the impassable transformation of my surroundings. I was not being harvested, I was being devoured. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. I was in immediate, profound danger, and there was nowhere left to hide. The hum, once a distant thrum, now filled the very marrow of my bones. It was a language without words, a low, guttural vibration that spoke of immense weight and patience, a slow, grinding hunger. My chest ached with its pressure, and the air around me thickened, tasting of damp earth and something acrid, like forgotten metal rusting in the dark. The cabin timbers groaned in concert, not with the familiar creaks of old wood settling, but with a new, deeper resonance, as if the house itself were a giant, ancient instrument played by an unseen hand. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the fog of my bewildered dread. This was no trick of the mind, no echo of grief. This was real, an encroaching presence that pressed against the fragile shell of my sanity. I had to leave. Now, my breath hitched as I stumbled toward the front door, my legs heavy, as if resisting the very act of escape. The floorboards beneath me seemed to undulate, a subtle, unsettling motion that made me question my footing. I fumbled for the keys to the old truck, my fingers clumsy and slick with a sudden, clammy sweat. They were in my pocket, thank God, or were they? A tremor ran through my hand as I patted the empty denim. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the earth's slow thrum. I swore I'd put them there after parking the truck this morning. A quick, desperate search of the small living room yielded nothing but dust motes dancing in the meager light. I checked the kitchen counter, the small table by the window, my backpack slung over a chair. Nothing. It was as if they had simply ceased to be. This wasn't just forgetfulness. I wouldn't. The forest path, though overgrown, was still there. I could walk. It was miles to the nearest road, but a straight line was a straight line. I wrenched open the front door, the wood screaming a protest, and stepped out into the twilight-drenched woods. The air outside was heavier, cloying like breathing through wet soil. The trees, usually a comforting, if imposing, presence, now loomed like skeletal sentinels, their branches gnarled fingers reaching, twisting. I plunged into the familiar path that led away from the cabin, boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. The hum, though fainter here, still vibrated in the soles of my feet, a subterranean heartbeat. The path grew narrower, the undergrowth thicker, thorns snagging at my clothes. I pushed through, my determination a raw, burning ember. But something was wrong. The trees were too close, too uniform. The light, filtering through the dense canopy, was a sickly green, almost phosphorescent. I passed a gnarled oak, its bark like an ancient face, and then minutes later I passed it again and again. The same twisted branch, the same patch of moss like a leprous stain. The path was looping, or the forest was making it loop. Every turn I took, every effort to forge a new direction, brought me back to the same stretch of twisted trees, the same uncanny familiarity. It was a labyrinth, but one that shifted and reconfigured itself with malevolent intent. The hum began to intensify, growing louder, closer, as if the very ground beneath me was laughing. I stumbled, falling to my knees on the damp earth, my hands sinking into a carpet of decaying leaves. My breath came in ragged gasps, my throat tight with fear. The forest was alive, and it did not want me to leave. It wanted me here within its grasp. Defeated, humiliated, I eventually found myself, inexplicably, standing before the cabin door again. The air within was thick with the hum, a palpable pressure that felt like hands pressing against my temples. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a soft, final sigh. The cabin was no longer merely old, it was wrong. The wood of the walls appeared to ripple in the dim light, its grain shifting, twisting into patterns that resembled veins or roots, pulsing faintly with a life that was not wood. My eyes, desperate for something familiar, something safe, darted around the room. Then the cabin vanished. Faded streamers, the kind used for a child's birthday party, hung askew from the ceiling, coated in a fine, unsettling layer of iridescent dust. A faint, cloying sweetness, like stale cake and disinfectant, hung heavy in the air, mingling with the ever-present hum, which here sounded like a broken loudspeaker. The silence was profound, unnatural, broken only by the distant, rhythmic drip of water somewhere unseen. The entire scene was a grotesque mockery of celebration, a joyful space rendered desolate and vaguely menacing. A wave of nausea washed over me, a dizzying lurch that threatened to buckle my knees. I clamped my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my hands into them, trying to banish the hallucinatory image. When I opened them again, the school hallway dissolved, replaced by the familiar, yet now profoundly unsettling living room of the cabin. But something had changed. On the far wall, where a faded landscape painting had hung, the canvas was now gone. In its place, the raw timber planks were exposed, but they were no longer uniform. It pulsed with a faint, internal light, mirroring the rhythmic hum that now emanated not just from the floor, but from the very walls themselves. The pattern wasn't random. It was forming a symbol, a familiar, ancient glyph I'd seen in one of my ancestors' journals, a depiction of a root system, but stylized, reaching, grasping. It was the entity, made manifest, slowly consuming the cabin, turning it into part of itself, like a fungal growth spreading across an organic host. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just beneath the earth. It was here. It was inside. And it was changing everything. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a skin, slowly turning itself inside out, revealing the monstrous thing it contained. I was trapped, not just by the forest, but by the very walls that surrounded me, walls that were now breathing, pulsing, becoming. The hum resonated within me, a growing cacophony that threatened to shatter my mind, leaving only the endless, patient breath of the thing that had finally awakened. The air outside, when I finally wrenched open the front door, was a cold, damp breath against my face, carrying the scent of pine needles and decay. My lungs burned with the sudden intake, a sharp counterpoint to the stagnant cabin air I'd grown accustomed to. I wouldn't be trapped. The mantra was a drumbeat in my skull, a fragile shield against the encroaching dread. Miles to the nearest road, yes, but a straight line was a straight line. I took a deep, shuddering breath and stepped out. The first few paces were a triumph, each crunch of dry leaves under my boots a small victory. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the gathering gloom, searching for any sign of a break in the trees, any hint of the world beyond this suffocating green embrace. My determination, a fragile thing, began to fray at the edges. The path, which had been clear only moments before, seemed to waver, the edges blurring into the surrounding undergrowth. The trees, once distinct, now appeared to meld, their trunks too uniform, their branches too perfectly intertwined. I pressed on, my pace quickening, a frantic energy seizing my limbs. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl, sharpened my senses to a painful degree, turning the benign sounds of the woods into harbingers of unseen threats. Then the world tilted. It wasn't a sudden jolt, but a slow, viscous shift. The earthy give beneath my feet grew unnaturally firm, then rigid. The damp, organic scent of the forest floor faded, replaced by the faint, acrid tang of disinfectant and stale, trapped air. The towering pines dissolved, not into mist, but into something else entirely. Above me, the gnarled canopy peeled back, revealing not sky, but a low, acoustical tile ceiling, stained with watermarks I couldn't quite place. My mind reeled, grasping for purchase, for logic. One moment I was navigating the ancient woods, the next I stood in a long, echoing corridor. On the opposite wall, faded posters proclaimed forgotten school events, their edges curling like dried leaves. But the wrong decorations were what truly froze me. Paper cutouts of grinning, skeletal figures dangled from invisible threads, swaying imperceptibly in the stale air. This wasn't merely a hallucination. It was a mimicry, a grotesque echo. The entity wasn't just in the cabin. It wasn't just under the forest. It could bend reality, twist familiar constructs into its own horrifying image. It consumed not just physical space, but the very idea of a space, regurgitating it in a form that was fundamentally, horrifyingly wrong. I walked, or rather drifted, down the endless corridor, my boots making no sound on the linoleum. The air was heavy, pregnant with the ghosts of forgotten laughter, and the scent of chalk dust mingled with something metallic and sweet, like fermenting fruit. Then I saw it. The event. A faint, rhythmic scratching sound emanated from beyond, like fingernails dragging across a blackboard. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to run back into the illusion of the forest, but a perverse curiosity, a desperate need to understand, pulled me forward. The classroom was bathed in the same sickly yellow light, but here it seemed weaker, struggling against an encroaching gloom. Desks and chairs were overturned, scattered like forgotten toys. On the blackboard, scrawled in what looked like dried mud, were repeating, intricate symbols, identical to those I'd found in the journals, swirling and interlocking. And from it, a single gnarled root, thick as a man's arm, snaked upwards, coiling around a child's forgotten wooden block tower. It pulsated with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a deep, resonant throb that I felt not in my ears, but in my very bones. The root was not just in the room. It was part of it, growing from the floor, merging with the dusty air, its tendrils reaching out like silent, hungry fingers. The entity wasn't merely a creature or a spirit. It was an encroaching consciousness, a primeval growth that consumed and assimilated drawing sustenance from the very fabric of existence, from memories, from places, twisting them into its own grotesque living architecture. The cabin, the forest, this school hallway, they were all just extensions of its reach, its tendrils pushing into my world, making it its own. I could feel it now, a subtle shift within my own body, a strange, fibrous sensation beneath my skin, a deep ache in my marrow. I was becoming intertwined, not just psychologically, but physically. The architect's descent wasn't just into madness. It was into an unwilling, agonizing transformation. I was becoming part of its blueprint. The forest hadn't disappeared. It had merely warped, revealing another facet of the thing that was slowly, inexorably consuming me. The trees seemed to lean inward, their boughs heavy with an unspoken weight, as if the very canopy itself conspired to hold me within its verdant, suffocating embrace. Escape wasn't a matter of simply walking away. The entity wasn't confined to the cabin's warped timbers. It was woven into the fabric of this place, a subterranean current that flowed beneath the roots of the oldest trees, through the veins of the earth itself. It had found me, and now it was drawing me in deeper. My gaze drifted back to the cabin. The wood, already scarred by time and damp, seemed to shift, its grain twisting into patterns that were almost, but not quite, recognizable. I felt a pull, not physical, but a deep, resonant hum within my bones, a vibration that promised answers, or perhaps only deeper questions. I had to go back in. Not out of fear, not entirely, but out of a desperate, gnawing need to understand, to confront this architect of my unraveling. The air inside was no longer just stagnant. It was heavy, thrumming with an almost tactile pressure. The familiar walls of the living room were gone. In their place, a long, narrow corridor stretched into the gloom, lit by an unnatural, sickly yellow light that hummed with a low, electrical current. It was a place I had never seen before, yet it felt disturbingly familiar, like a half-remembered dream. The tiled floor, a mosaic of faded linoleum squares, gleamed with a residual sheen of recent scrubbing, yet dust motes danced in the anemic light, undisturbed. But the decorations, oh, the decorations. Instead of bright construction paper shapes or children's drawings, the bulletin boards were covered in dried, pressed botanical specimens that writhed with unnatural, fibrous veins, like petrified arteries, where a banner might proclaim, "Welcome back." A long, leathery strip of something unidentifiable hung, covered in intricate, organic patterns that pulsed with a faint, internal light, like slow, rhythmic heartbeats. A profound disquiet settled over me. This was not the cabin, not truly. This was a projection, a distortion, a manifestation of the entity's presence, its insidious influence on reality itself. Each step I took echoed unnaturally, the clack of my boots too loud, too sharp in the suffocating stillness. The air tasted of ozone and damp earth, a primal, subterranean tang that clawed at the back of my throat. I walked slowly, my hand grazing the cool metal of the lacquers. This was its work, its design. It was building something here, reforming, reshaping. The wrong decorations were its nascent art, its terrifying aesthetic. A faint, earthy luminescence pulsed from within, drawing me forward with an irresistible, terrifying curiosity. This was it, I knew. The core, the heart of the matter. My breath hitched, a ragged gasp in the thick air. I stepped through. The space beyond was vast, cavernous, yet without discernible walls or ceiling. In the center of this impassable chamber, something pulsed. It was not a creature with eyes or limbs, not a monster in any conventional sense. It was a vast, sprawling network of roots and veins, a subterranean heart, ancient beyond comprehension. It pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a deep thrumming that resonated through my very bones, shaking the marrow. It was the forest, yes, but more. It was the earth itself, the deep, primeval hunger that lay beneath. It was a force of dissolution and recreation, a vast, patient architect that broke down all matter, all life, and then rebuilt it according to its own alien, incomprehensible design. My ancestors hadn't appeased it. They had fed it, willingly or unwillingly, becoming components in its slow, deliberate process. The cabin, the forest, my very sanity, all were merely raw materials. It wasn't cosmic in the sense of stars or distant galaxies, but cosmic in its scale, its indifference, its terrifying, fundamental nature. It was the universe of rot and renewal, twisted into a horror that consumed not for malice, but for an instinctual, geological imperative. It was the ultimate patient designer, and I, Seth, was merely the next intricate detail in its final, sprawling blueprint. Join the design. It was an invitation, a promise of absorption, of becoming part of something infinitely vast and terrifyingly eternal. But a pebble can still create a ripple. I looked at the pulsing heart of it, felt its insidious pull, and in that moment, a desperate choice solidified. I could succumb, or I could try to disrupt its design, even if it meant my own shattering. The mantra was a whisper, thin and reedy, against the roaring silence of the woods. The cabin, a skeletal silhouette behind me, seemed to pulse, a faint, almost imperceptible thrum that vibrated not through the ground, but through the marrow of my bones. I stumbled forward, my boots sinking into the spongy moss, each step a futile attempt to outrun the tendrils of dread that had rooted themselves deep within me. The trees, once a comforting canopy, now loomed like skeletal sentinels, their branches gnarled and reaching, as if to ensnare me. The forest floor was a tapestry of decay, fallen leaves slick with an unnatural moisture, the scent of mildew and something else, something ancient and ferrous, clinging to the air. The light, already waning, seemed to dim even further, swallowed by the sheer density of the foliage. Then a flicker, not of light but of perception. The trees wavered, their forms blurring at the edges, and the ground beneath my feet hardened, losing its yielding give. The scent of pine vanished, replaced by the faint, unsettling aroma of dust and stale air freshener. My vision snapped into focus, but the world had warped. I was no longer in the forest. The larkers, painted a faded institutional blue, were adorned with grotesque, hand-drawn caricatures of children, their eyes empty black pits, their smiles stretched into rictus grins. Streamers, molded from something that looked like dried sinew, hung limp from the ceiling, festooned with withered, unidentifiable blossoms that smelled vaguely of formaldehyde. On the bulletin boards, instead of student artwork, were yellowed, curling photographs of faces I didn't recognize, their features distorted, as if seen through rippling water, each face subtly different, yet sharing an unsettling familiarity. One photograph, tacked askew, showed a man with eyes like mine, his mouth agape in a silent scream. This wasn't a memory. It was a violation, an intrusion. I tried to move, to run from this impassable tableau, but my legs felt weighted, rooted to the linoleum floor. The air grew thick, shimmering, and the walls of the hallway began to undulate, the larkers twisting, the grotesque decorations seeming to writhe and stretch. A low hum began, not from the lights, but from everywhere, a resonant frequency that vibrated through my teeth, rattling my bones. The floor buckled, cracks spiderwebbing across the linoleum, and from these fissures rose a faint, acrid mist, smelling of damp soil and something impassably old. Then a voice. You sought solace. The hallway dissolved, melting like wax, the larkers collapsing into mounds of damp clay, the fluorescent lights shattering into glittering dust. I was falling, but not through air. The pact endures, a vessel for the awakening. I understood then. The journals, the artifacts, the consuming presence in the cabin, it wasn't about appeasement or control. It was about perpetuation. My ancestors hadn't fought it, they had fed it. They had prepared the way, generation after generation, for a final, complete assimilation. My personal loss, the raw grief that had drawn me to this desolate place, had been the perfect lure, the fertile ground for its expansion. I wasn't just inheriting a cabin. I was inheriting a destiny, a gruesome role in an ancient, endless cycle. I felt roots, not just beneath me, but through me, tendrils of ancient earth weaving into my flesh, becoming one with my veins, my nerves. My lungs burned, not with the need for air, but with the crushing weight of the soil, yet I did not suffocate. My heart still beat, a frantic, trapped bird, but its rhythm was slowing, becoming synchronized with the deep, slow pulse of the earth itself. We awaken. We are many. We are one. Asterisk my mind, once a fortress of thought and memory, began to fray at the edges. The wrong decorations in that impassable hallway, the distorted faces. They were echoes, residual imprints of those who had come before, those who had been absorbed. their memories twisted into grotesque adornments by the entity's vast, consuming consciousness. The face of my loved one, once so vivid, became indistinct, then just a feeling, then nothing at all. My name, Seth, felt alien, a discarded skin. I was becoming vast, formless, yet still strangely aware. I was the cabin, breathing its stagnant air. I was the entity, and the entity was me. The fresh start I had sought was not for myself, but for the primeval thing that now pulsed beneath the ancient forest, its consciousness expanded, its hunger renewed.